Välkomna hit till det här seminariet som vi har kallat Demokratin som formalitet. Eller i andra annonser har det stått postdemokratin, men det är i praktiken samma sak som ni kommer att förstå när ni har lyssnat på den här kvällen. Jag heter Petter Larsson, jag representerar tidningsföreningen Efterarbetet, som är det lilla rest som finns kvar av den stolta veckotidningen Efterarbetet, som inte finns längre men som existerar i viss mening i form av de här seminarierna som vi gör 10 gånger om året eller sådär. Vi arrangerar detta tillsammans med ABF i Malmö som ni vet har sitt finger med i allting roligt och radikalt som händer i den här stan, och med tidskriften Tiden. But today we're trying to make it up to you by bringing you the writer himself. Please welcome Colin Crouch.
Thank you, Petter. After that introduction, I can only disappoint you. By post-democracy, I have to always stress, I do not mean non-democracy. I do not mean an absence of democracy. I use the term post-democratic in the way that we use the term post-industrial or even post-modern. When we say these things, we do not mean that industrial society has gone away. A post-industrial society still uses all the products of industry. We still make things in post-industrial society. When we say post-industrial society, we mean that, oh yes, industry is still there, but somehow the energy and the dynamism of the economic system have gone somewhere else into the services sectors. And I wanted to capture that idea with post-democracy. All the institutions exist. Democracy is there. There are elections, there are parties, governments fall and governments rise. There is the rule of law. There's freedom of speech, there's human rights. But somehow the democratic system is not producing the energy of politics that it ought to do, because I said gradually this is disappearing into small circles of overlapping political and economic elites. I didn't claim in the book that we were already in post-democracy, because to me there are still examples of where movements emerge out of the population and take the political elites by surprise, and they then have to adjust to them. The environmentalist movement, feminism, have been 2 major movements of that kind. And although I don't like to talk about it, racist populism is doing the same at the moment. I saw 3 main causes of this development, or 2 main ones, and then a third one which is in a kind of consequence of the others. The first one I've already hinted at, and that is the incapacity of modern lower social classes to develop a political agenda as their industrial predecessors had, as they had to struggle for political rights. In fact, most of the political identities that historically formed democracy came out of struggles about political inclusion and political exclusion. And so it's not so easy for the groups who form I can't call it the proletariat really, but the kind of lower classes, non-elite classes of post-industrial society. It's not so easy for them to come to an identity of who they are, because no one's defining them as being excluded. Secondly, this major historical change is taking place alongside the globalization of the economy. So one has now increasingly a shift in the level at which the economy is being directed and decisions made about it, and the level at which democracy operates. In Europe, we at least have something of a transnational democracy in the European Parliament, and we should take it seriously. But in general in the world, and for Europe, above the level of Europe, we do not have a level of democratic engagement that can talk on the same level as the enormous multinational corporations who really among themselves regulate the global economy. Of course, governments are represented on things like the World Trade Organization and the IMF and the World Bank. There is a kind of international politics of the economy, but it's only very, very indirectly democratic. You never get a debate in an election in a country about what shall the country's policy be towards the World Trade Organization. It just doesn't happen. So there's two major reasons why democracy is finding it hard to do its job of representing real popular interests about very serious issues. Now, as we've got a party system that has stayed rather static as formed by the great religious and class conflicts of pre-industrial and industrial society, so parties have come to represent less and less a real large mass population. And increasingly politicians find that they share a world with a business elite, and they don't really share a world of their party people, because anyway the party doesn't represent the people anyway. A lot of people on the left in 2008 was saying, aha, right, finally this system was messed up. Right? We've got them now. They said they wanted a deregulated financial world. They've got it, and look what it's done. Right? And I was thinking, no, that it's not the end of neoliberalism. It's not the end of deregulated global finance. It will survive. It won't die. And that was really that there are two ways in which neoliberalism can develop. One is the way that it presents itself, and that is as being about free markets, about a lot of competition, therefore a lot of choice for consumers, a decline in the need for politics, because if you have a society of markets, you don't need much politics. That notion of less politics is on my mind at the moment, because last week another little book I've written was shortlisted for a prize at the Frankfurt Book Fair, prize given by Goldman Sachs. So I thought, well, if I win this, it's like a feminist winning the Taliban prize. But it was won by a book called Less Politics. Surprise, surprise. So that's the first presentation of neoliberalism, and rather attractive in a way, especially in a world that's rather disillusioned with politics. But there's another form of neoliberalism, and that's a neoliberalism that is actually not about multiply competitive free markets. It's about big, huge corporations that in fact do not bring you less politics, because they're so large and because they're so rich, they engage in politics. They engage with politicians. This is a further development of my idea of a political business elite. And it comes through this ambiguity in what neoliberal theory means with competition. It gives you this notion, the interesting idea, what actually is a market economy? Is it one where there's a large number of competing firms, or is it one dominated by the winners of a competition? And to the extent it's the second one, then many of the things that neoliberals claim to offer us are not true. That it's not true that there's multiple choice in important sectors, and it's not true that you get less politics. You get more politics, because you get a small number of corporations lobbying governments, going even further than that, as in the case of Goldman Sachs, and actually becoming in governments. And this becomes especially important at a time when many things that used to be run by the state, including increasingly now public services, are being privatized. And you get, if you look at and this is something that Sweden knows about even more than my country, privatization of public services, if you look, who is the customer? The customer is actually a government, might be a local government, might be a central government, who buys services from a private company. The ordinary public, the parents at the school, the people using a health service, the people having their rubbish bins emptied, they are not customers. They are simply users, because the actual purchaser is a public authority. So you often get in these sectors a very small number of corporations dealing with a very small number of political decision makers. And that is not the non-political market that neoliberalism offers us. Instead, it's a market dominated by enormous corporations who get a kind of political privilege. Now, so this is one of the arguments that I was developing in this second book as to why neoliberalism didn't collapse as a force when it had collapsed intellectually, is because the power behind it, in the corporate concept of neoliberalism, not the free market concept, was so politically entrenched. I had a second argument in the book too, which is about how important private debt had become in the neoliberal economy. Some really bad debts were packaged up and were sold on, creating an enormous amount of credit, so that in particular in the United States, workers whose wages had been stagnant or falling for some years were able to sustain their consumption because of the enormous debt they were undertaking. Debt that the banks knew they would never repay, but they thought they would sell on the debt and it would just disappear into the system. And it did disappear into the system until 2008, when it all collapsed. Now, that system was so tempting for governments, especially neoliberal ones, because it meant that the public could keep on buying things. And that's what they want us to do more than anything else, to keep buying things without having the money to do it. Right? The magic answer. And that's another reason why they couldn't let this system fail. And so you will notice that although after 2008, the political system everywhere said, oh, this is terrible, we can't let bankers do this, we must regulate them. Gradually, as the months pass, more and more of that is disappearing from the political agenda. And so these were the reasons why I said that neoliberalism wouldn't die. It might have failed intellectually, but it had power, important, really important power. Also, what I was trying to do in that argument was to develop more this idea that the kind of new political formation of a corporate elite, which is a political actor and not just an economic one. And I said in the book that we always talk about state versus market, right? And that's how our politics is defined. More state, more market, left, right. That's how it is, right? But actually, it was a triangle. It's state, market, and corporation. And it's not necessarily the case that market and corporation are together against state. Or you might even get politics or state and corporations against the market. So there's a dangerous triangle there where a citizen has to try and work out where her interests are. And once again in this book, without going very far into it, I said we have to develop not a triangle, but a four-sided figure. And that because the state is so dependent on capital, we can't trust the democratic political system to do all the work for us. As citizens, we have to support movements and campaigns and issue groups who are taking up these issues of the behavior of corporations. Sometimes we should make a politics directly with corporations. Don't bother to go through politics for it. If you've got a corporation that's behaving badly, you make a public issue of that corporation and shame them. And new media, social media, have made it much, much easier to do that. And so I say what we want is a politics, a four-sided politics, state, market, corporation, and civil society. But, of course, the civil society part of that is so much weaker. And so that ended up also being a very pessimistic book. What is it that social democracy should be about now? In a society that's becoming post-democratic, which has certain implications, where the party system is becoming less useful to us, and also in a society dominated by these two forms of neoliberalism, either a belief in intensified competition in one interpretation, and then this dominance by corporate power in another interpretation. And so I therefore say, right, actually, if we're angry about something in the capitalist economy, it's often because you're confronted with corporate power and not the real market. So I think the starting point is the market. But we also know that the market has negative consequences, what economists call negative externalities. So you make market and you produce some good effects, but you also produce something negative by doing it. And the real difficulty of both public life and private life is working out that balance. We see it most clearly and obviously in environmental questions. If you build a new factory or a new power plant or something, you do produce an economic good, because products are produced that people want to have and it enriches their lives and they want to buy them. But while you're doing that, you probably also produce some environmental bads. And every time someone makes a new mobile phone that we're ever so happy to use, some poor worker in the silicon mines is getting a disease. Right? So, and that doesn't feature in the cost calculations of the production of mobile phones. It's an externality, and it's a negative one. Now, as well, yeah, okay, making that economic product had some damage, but actually the value from the market product is so great, we just have to accept the damage. It's never easy to make the decision, but what the important thing is to recognize that the decision does have to be made. And if you go along with pure neoliberalism, they say, well, no, always what's reflected in the market price is all that matters. And if something's outside the market, then it doesn't matter unless the people hurt by the damage are willing to compensate the producer. But there are many other areas of life where this works. Making labour markets more efficient and flexible has a negative consequence in stress and sometimes actual poverty of working people. You have to look at that and you say, what do we do to compensate? What do we do if we're going to intensify market processes in the economy? What do we do to ensure that that doesn't have negative consequences for people's actual lives? And we know about a number of social policies that help there. And so it's not so easy for the groups who form I can't call it the proletariat really, but the kind of lower classes, non-elite classes of post-industrial society. It's not so easy for them to come to an identity of who they are because no one's defining them as being excluded. Secondly, this major historical change is taking place alongside the globalization of the economy. So one has now increasingly a shift in the level at which the economy is being directed and decisions made about it, and the level at which democracy operates. In Europe, we at least have something of a transnational democracy in the European Parliament, and we should take it seriously. But in general in the world, and for Europe above the level of Europe, we do not have a level of democratic engagement that can talk on the same level as the enormous multinational corporations who really among themselves regulate the global economy. Of course, governments are represented on things like the World Trade Organization and the IMF and the World Bank. There is a kind of international politics of the economy, but it's only very, very indirectly democratic. You never get a debate in an election in a country about what shall the country's policy be towards the World Trade Organization. It just doesn't happen. So there's two major reasons why democracy is finding it hard to do its job of representing real popular interests about very serious issues. And demanding more and more market, we therefore actually need also more and more measures to check and regulate markets. It's not that you either have more market or more regulation. You actually need the two to go together. And those of you here who read the works of Karl Polanyi, who I wrote in, he died in the 1940s, and he wrote about the early English Industrial Revolution, but he's been rediscovered in recent years precisely because his account of the English Industrial Revolution was about the destruction of systems of social support by marketization, and on the problem of what do you do when the market, for all its progressive work, has also destroyed things? What do you do about that? And it's a very relevant question now because marketization is destroying quite a few of our accustomed ways, and we have to find new answers. So to me, the future, therefore, social democracy, I see as being the main political force that stands for welcoming markets but on conditions. And that to me is how social democrats need to define themselves, not as something that defends a museum of past achievements, but as something which is very much oriented to the future. And for me, the great historical achievement of social democracy was not that it conquered capitalism, because it never did. It was precisely because it kept a constant tension with capitalism that required repeated social compromises that actually turned out to be extremely productive for a good social life. You see this if you compare Eastern and Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, capitalism was conquered. It didn't produce a socialist utopia. In Western Europe, we had a continuing tension with, and the trouble is I'm using the past tense here, you see, because I think we're losing this now. There was a tension in which, especially around the middle of the 20th century, going on into a few decades after that, on the one hand, capital and wealth were always unsure about how much power the great majority of ordinary people had. And the political representatives of the mass of ordinary people were always worried about the power of the wealth. These were two asymmetrical forms of power, and they made compromises with each other. Sometimes these were useful compromises, sometimes they were poor compromises. And I think any historian of social democracy would say that the best compromises were made in this part of the world, because it was here that social democracy was strongest. And you all know this, right? I don't need to tell you this. And that didn't mean that Nordic social democracy conquered capitalism. It meant it could make better compromises with it. Partly because these societies were small economies, open economies, you always have had to accept competitiveness. You've always known you had to have efficient economies that could compete in the world. There was never a socialist protectionism. If you look for protectionism in Western Europe, you find it among right-wing regimes, never among the social democratic ones. So Swedish and Danish, Norwegian, Finnish social democracy have always had to be in contention, finding their way around a market economy. We've got to be competitive in global markets, and in Sweden, more than in Denmark, you've got these enormous corporations. How do we find a path through that? And that's what made politics in this part of the world so creative. Not because you beat capitalism, but because you stayed in permanent contention with it. And my worry now is that if we get this continuing triumph of corporate neoliberalism based on enormous concentrations of transnational wealth, on the one hand, and a decline in an autonomous politics of lower social classes of post-industrial society, on the other hand, then that compromise starts to go. And capitalism doesn't need to make compromises so much anymore. And that's what I think and fear we're starting to see. And which is why I want a more assertive social democracy. Now, what I say we have to do is to surround that world with a world of campaigns and struggles and issues, so that you do your social democracy in your daily life and not just by voting or being a member of a party. So it's a nested social democracy I'm looking for. Now, I did say that the majority, but the large majority of people in the lower socioeconomic groups in the new services sector are actually women. And in a way, the women's movement is probably that expression of post-industrial working class society. Working class is the wrong word for it in a way, but the lower sort of income groups. And women have, of course, although they haven't been, quite a long while ago stopped being politically excluded, there is a kind of exclusion of women that's still being fought over. And women do have more of a chance of developing a consciousness than men. And so I think that the social democracy of the future will increasingly have to be one that is led by women and gives a female interpretation of political issues. In the same way, you see, that the original working class movement, it stood for men and women. Obviously, it wasn't just a male movement, but it was heavily male. Industrial workers, certainly in Europe, were by an enormous majority male, except for the clothing and textile industries. The movements were dominated by men as leaders, and a lot of the agenda was a male agenda. You still get it in Germany with it, the notion of the male breadwinner. A man must earn enough money to keep his wife and children. That part of the social democratic concept was of the working man being able to support his family. So it wasn't that it was a male movement, therefore hostile to women, but it was a male interpretation of the world. And I think increasingly, if we're going to get change and an interesting new politics, it will be because all of our interests are more interpreted by women's views. Which I can't, obviously, normally you're told when you make a proposal, well, give us details, and I can, no, I can't, man, can't do it. It's up to women to do it. But I was saying earlier, there is a kind of shared neoliberal social democratic agenda around women, an anti-conservative shared agenda. But the social democratic part of that needs to be more clarified. It comes through more easily in issues like the obvious things like childcare, but there's also ways in which women, because of the character of their lives as being embedded in families as well as in work, far more than men are, women have a multi-sided view of life and are more likely to see the need for markets to be integrated in society than perhaps men do. When social democracy fully defines itself as being part of the post-industrial world, and I think the key part, the most important single thing of all of that would be for a more feminine-led social democracy, supported as always by lots of campaigning groups. Finished.
If this is a problem, and what we can do to solve it. I think the ideas of post-democracy is one of the most important theories in order to understand the current crisis of social democracy. For how is it possible that social democracy in this era of increasing inequality, growing market power, and mass unemployment in Europe and the West fails to formulate a policy on how this crisis couldn't be solved? I have been active in Social Democrats and the youth organization for 20 years. It sounds crazy, I think, but it's true. And I can say that without measure of political grief that something is fundamentally rotten in this party. It's rotten in the sense that the party debate, and I have been the editor of the magazines, I have been a member of the party congress, you can't say that the party debate has any influence of the policy of the party anymore. And I think that I have a feeling that the argument does not bite anymore, that policy is shaped by different standards than what is best for the working classes and the community cohesion. So, if it's not the party members setting agenda, who is setting the agenda?
Colin Crouch talar om att människor, väljarna, i vårt demokratiska samhälle blir manipulerade av en sorts elit som därigenom styr politiken. Stämmer den analysen? Och vilka intressen är det i så fall som styr i Sverige?
Alltså man måste väl se att jag håller verkligen med Colin Crouch, och jag tror att man ska se att det är liksom en rörelse mot att det är liksom en elit som styr allt mer. Och det är ju också han inne på i sina böcker, att det är inte så att antingen så styr folket eller så styr en elit, utan det är hela tiden en dragkamp liksom mellan olika intressen och grupper. Och det är uppenbarligen så att liksom just nu så har liksom, sedan ett antal decennier då, 2-3 decennier, så har företagseliten allt mer liksom kommit att smälta ihop tillsammans med den här liksom stora politiska eliten. Och det är liksom det som är problemet med demokratin. Liksom. Många har ju diskuterat liksom, vad är problemet med demokratin? Är det att folk inte röstar? Medan Colin Crouch börjar liksom i ändan, varför vill inte folk rösta? Och det är uppenbarligen då att politiken spelar mindre roll. Det är liksom, om folk röstar eller hur folk röstar spelar mindre roll än det gjorde tidigare. Och då sjunker valdeltagandet och engagemanget. Och lösningen är liksom då att man helt enkelt måste stärka upp demokratin. Alltså den måste bli mer potent helt enkelt. Det måste spela mer roll vad som händer i politiken. Så att jag håller med honom om det. Och frågan då vem det är som styr, ja, det är uppenbarligen så att företagens makt ökar. Och väljarnas, medborgarnas, folkrörelsernas makt minskar. Liksom. Det är det som händer.
I think that is what's happening now in the Social Democratic Party. That some of these people, they call themselves Social Democrats, are paid from the big business and big corporations to change the Social Democratic Party from inside. We have long and often talked about this neoliberal revolution. I think Sweden is no exception from the overall trend in the Western world, maybe with some special features. First, the image of Swedish politicians and parties as free from corruption, I think that prevent us from seeing the change that occur. Second, the trait of cooperation and corporativism in the social democratic and both Swedish model, the welfare state of Sweden, create broad interfaces between labor and business. The lobby was already here. When my think tank Katalys last year, or this spring actually, 2013, summarized all known articles in the media database about the debate on profit in welfare sector in the spring, in April this year, before the Social Democratic Party Congress, we found out that between 85 and 95% of the argumentation pro-profit in the welfare sector came from paid lobbyists. Sweden has today one of the most liberalized welfare systems in the world, where private companies can run schools, retirement homes and healthcare without any restriction and are allowed to make profit from tax money.
Vad har ni på Tankesmedjan Katalys för vision av ett demokratiskt samhälle? Hur skulle ni vilja att det fungerar istället då?
Ja, alltså det borde ju vara så att liksom demokratin och medborgarna sätter gränserna för marknaden till exempel. Och ska man vara lite mer konkret kan man säga att just nu finns det, jag tycker det är så uppenbart att just nu finns det opinionsmätningar som visar då att 90% av svenska folket är väldigt tveksamma eller direkta motståndare till vinstuttag i välfärden. Och gäller skolan så är det ännu mer motstånd mot det här med privatiseringar och vinstuttag. Och samtidigt så vågar knappt några politiker till vänster, eller liksom förutom vänsterpartister då i stort sett, protestera mot det här tydligt. Och det är ju liksom, då är det något fel på politiken. Och jag tror att det beror på att de här företagen som driver vård, skola och omsorg i privat drift, de har delvis då hyrt in politiker, framförallt socialdemokrater, som för deras talan. Och det påverkar väldigt mycket då. Om det i den här partieliten och kring partiledningen finns liksom, ja men nästan agitatorer då för storföretagen. Det är klart att det spelar roll liksom.
As Colin Crouch illuminate, threaten also the deeper form of democracy. I think this is the major problem in today's political landscape, where social democracy collapses while the extreme right is growing. The future of social democracy is all about how we answer this question. And my generation's most important task at hand is to formulate a policy to repair society destroyed by a neoliberal social democracy, and to build up a social democracy so self-confident that we can close the door to the lobby and corporate interests again. Thank you.
Vad krävs för att göra samhället mer demokratiskt?
Ja, alltså man måste ju ha partier som vill att folkviljan ska råda. Och det som också är en del av historien, det är att det här kommer ju aldrig komma utifrån att någon uppifrån skänker folk demokrati. Liksom. Nu ska ni få demokrati. Utan det har ju alltid handlat om att människor har, genom att liksom bilda fackföreningar och partier och ta makten, strejka om det så behövs, helt enkelt tar makt, skapar makt. Och när det händer, då kan den här eliten där uppe själva till liksom, och säga att ja, men nu får vi ha parlamentarisk demokrati, eller nu måste vi ge mer reformer till de här människorna så att de lugnar ner sig. Så att väldigt mycket av det vi sett under 1900-talet, det har ju varit en omförhandling av makt och resurser som har skapats av att vanliga människor, kvinnorörelser, fackföreningar, politiska partier, de har liksom skapat en motmakt. Och då har det cashat in reformer. Och när man slutar organisera det här motståndet, slutar organisera kvinnogrupper, slutar organisera fackföreningar, slutar ha socialistiska partier som har socialistiska krav, liksom, då kommer det här rulla tillbaka. Det är liksom hela tiden som en kraftmätning och slutar, det är som en brottningsmatch. Och slutar den ena brottaren liksom att brottas, den röda brottaren, då kommer den blå att vinna. Det är liksom det vi håller på. Nu liksom ligger arbetarrörelsen i parterrunderläge med 3-0 med 1 minut kvar i en OS-final på något sätt mot kapitalet. Och då måste man liksom börja brottas, man måste fightas. Och det är säkert så att liksom den här kampen mot privatiseringar och sänkta löner och så vidare, det kommer att vara en ganska tuff kamp. Det tar kanske flera decennier att vinna den. Men man måste börja.